Have you ever heard a voice so distinct, so layered with both pain and hope that you instantly feel you've known the singer his entire life? David Ruffin had precisely that kind of voice. In the mid-1960s, he stepped to the microphone, sang a single note, and all of Motown seemed to stand still in awe. Over half a century later, music lovers can still feel the echo of that singular tone whenever they hear My Girl or Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Yet for all his vocal splendor, he was once found dying in near anonymity, abandoned at a hospital entrance with no identification, far from the glamorous spotlight that once followed him. How does one man travel that distance, from being the shining crown jewel of a legendary group to being left on the margins of existence? Sometimes the truth is as stark as it is tragic. David Ruffin's life soared to spectacular heights, only to crash in a slow, spiraling tragedy that ended too soon. And yet amidst the heartbreak and scandal, there remains a voice that defined an era and changed soul music forever. In order to truly understand David Ruffin, we should step back in time to the place where he grew up. He was born Davis Eli Ruffin on January 18, 1941, in the unincorporated community of Wynot, Mississippi, where the rural landscape was dotted with fields and the modest homes of families, often struggling to make ends meet. In those days, Mississippi was a world marked by segregation and cultural upheaval, but it was also a wellspring of African American music, especially gospel. That was the musical environment in which young David was immersed. His father, Elias Eli Ruffin, was a traveling minister who brought his children to church revivals and tent shows. From an early age, David found himself alongside gospel choirs, tapping his foot to the rhythmic clapping of congregations. He might have been a young boy, but he was already inhaling the soulful air that would define his art. David's early years weren't easy. His mother, Ophelia, passed away when he was young, leaving a significant emotional void. By many accounts, David's father was a strict disciplinarian who wanted his children to walk the righteous path. Often that meant long hours in church and sharp reprimands if any child strayed from the moral codes set by their father's convictions. For David, life under his father's roof was marked by discipline, limited comforts, and an ever-present weight of expectation. Music became both an escape and a responsibility. If you imagine a small boy, eyes shining with curiosity, following his father's traveling ministry from one Mississippi church house to another, you can almost hear the seeds of that soulful voice beginning to form. The rural South at the time was a hotbed of gospel, Delta blues, and the earliest forms of soul. It was in this mixture of devotion and raw emotion that David Ruffin found his first spark. In that Mississippi gospel circuit, David wasn't alone. He had older siblings, including a brother, Jimmy Ruffin, who would also become a celebrated Motown singer in his own right. The two shared a passion for music from an early age. Jimmy with a slightly smoother and gentler vocal approach, David with that raspy powerhouse edge that seemed to scald the microphone. Before their teenage years had fully dawned, both brothers started daydreaming of bigger stages and bigger crowds. They soon grew restless under their father's rules. David especially chafed at the idea of becoming a traveling minister, like his father wanted him to be. Instead, he had an unquenchable thirst to reach out to the world with that raw, emotive voice. By the time David turned 14, he set out on his own, following the dream that glowed inside him like a lantern. He sang in local gospel groups, sometimes picking up small gigs here and there, a face among many, yet he had something that stood out. He sounded older and more experienced than his years. People who heard him live sometimes recalled how a hush would fall over the crowd when he stepped up to sing. It was as if all the bruises of life, from heartbreak to hopes, were captured in his tone. For a teenage boy, that was an astonishing gift. It was only a matter of time before bigger opportunities came knocking. In the mid to late 1950s, African American music was undergoing a transformation, with gospel crossing into secular territory to give birth to rhythm and blues, and from there to soul. Memphis, Detroit, and Chicago were lighting up with new talent. Each city had its own vibe, its own scene. Detroit, however, had Berry Gordy's Motown, a label that was soon to be crowned the Hit Factory. Motown was forging a bright, crossover-friendly sound, with artists like Smokey Robinson, Mary Wells, and Marvin Gaye, all of whom would soon become household names. For a young talent with a voice that could stand a church on its head, Motown was the ultimate destination. David Ruffin wanted to be there more than anywhere else. His first big break in the secular music world came in the early 1960s, but not directly as a lead singer. He hung around the Motown scene, sometimes as a background vocalist, other times just as a presence at the famed Hitsville USA building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. He was known for wearing thick-rimmed glasses, exuding a quirky, almost shy charm in person, until he sang, and that shy demeanor exploded into fiery soul. In 1964, destiny knocked in the form of The Temptations. Originally made up of Otis Williams, Elbridge Al Bryant, later replaced by David Ruffin, Melvin Franklin, Paul Williams, and Eddie Kendricks, The Temptations were a promising vocal group. They had yet to skyrocket to stardom, but Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson saw big potential. The group had a rotating door of lead vocalists, with Eddie Kendricks' higher tenor frequently cutting through the group's harmonies. But one day, Smokey Robinson asked David to step forward and sing lead on a new track they were working on. That track, as history would remember, was My Girl. The moment David's voice locked in, gentle yet resonant, conveying an almost uncontainable emotion, everyone knew something magical was happening. When My Girl was released, it soared to the top of the charts in 1965. Suddenly, The Temptations became the sweethearts of Motown, and David Ruffin was its golden-voiced frontman. Those early years with The Temptations were luminous. They toured extensively, often performing multiple shows a day. David became known for his charismatic stage presence, a combination of earnest humility and show-stopping flair. By then, he'd adopted a signature look: thick-rimmed eyeglasses, slick suits, and a certain swagger that balanced on the edge of confidence and vulnerability. The fans adored him, especially after the group followed up My Girl with hits like Since I Lost My Baby, Beauty Is Only Skin Deep, and Ain't Too Proud to Beg. David's voice defined the Temptations sound during that golden era. Yet, underneath the smooth choreography and immaculately produced hits, something more complicated was brewing. The music industry, particularly in the 1960s, was a high-pressure world. Long tours, intense recording schedules, and constant public appearances often took their toll on artists. Motown, for all its success, was also known for its relentless drive for chart-topping singles. The expectation of perfection and the constant hustle could crush a performer's spirit if they didn't have a strong personal anchor. And David, who had grown up with a strict father and had already tasted the extremes of both discipline and freedom, found himself grappling with newfound fame and personal demons. An early sign of trouble was David's growing sense of entitlement. Fueled by his success and singled out by fans who clamored for the lead, David began to consider himself the undisputed star of The Temptations. He demanded special billing, David Ruffin and The Temptations, a request that Berry Gordy and the group outright refused. Tension escalated. David, once a team player, started skipping rehearsals, arriving late for gigs, and showing up at studio sessions in a state that worried his bandmates. He was dabbling with substances, at first casually, but it wasn't long before whispers about cocaine abuse began to circle. The combination of drug use, inflated ego, and an increasingly erratic temper created a toxic undercurrent within the group. By 1967, the cracks were too wide to ignore. Though David continued to front hits like I Wish It Would Rain, behind the scenes, the friction was tearing the group apart. David's outbursts and unpredictability threatened not only the Temptations' unity, but also their professional reputation. Motown had invested heavily in the group. There was no room for one member's meltdown. In June 1968, after repeated attempts to deal with his behavior, the other members decided enough was enough. During a Cleveland concert, David was physically removed from the stage, effectively dismissed. Dennis Edwards was brought in to replace him, and the Temptations moved forward, leaving David devastated, furious, and suddenly alone. That was the turning point. Though David attempted to rebound with a solo career, life had grown complicated. His first solo single, My Whole World Ended the Moment You Left Me, did reasonably well, peaking in the top 10 on the R&B charts. But this early success didn't translate into a lasting reign at the top. David's battles with addiction became more public, and his legal issues, ranging from drug possession charges to paternity suits, turned him into a tabloid curiosity. Friends and industry insiders recalled seeing a haunted look in his eyes, as though the precarious balance he had once managed was dissolving, leaving behind a man at war with himself. During the 1970s, David sometimes managed to release music that glimmered with traces of his old brilliance. Songs like Walk Away from Love in 1975 reminded everyone that his voice was still a force of nature. But behind the scenes, chaos reigned. He displayed controlling behavior toward lovers and began to alienate producers with his unreliability. Time and again, opportunities slipped away. Even attempts at reuniting with the Temptations for special appearances were marred by David's tardiness or erratic behavior. On one infamous occasion, he missed a plane to a reunion gig, leaving the rest of the group in a lurch. His response when confronted was combative and unapologetic. More than once, his friends asked him to seek help for his drug dependence, but David's pride and paranoia, aggravated by substance abuse, kept him from accepting consistent support. There's a poignant story from the late 1970s where David found himself in a local Detroit bar, face unshaven, clothes rumpled, no longer sporting the carefully curated Motown look that once left fans breathless. A small house band was playing a set of R&B standards. Recognizing him, the band leader invited David to the stage. With a nervous shrug, David walked up to the mic, introduced himself simply as David, and launched into an impromptu rendition of My Girl. Initially, some patrons didn't believe it was actually him. This disheveled man seemed miles away from the polished star on magazine covers. But the moment he sang that first note, the entire bar went silent. People later recounted that it was pure magic, a moment so full of sorrow and longing that tears ran down the cheeks of more than a few listeners. When the song ended, the ovation was thunderous. Yet David's own eyes were said to be downcast, as though he couldn't quite accept the love or applause he once thrived upon. After the show, he slipped away into the night, a ghost of his former glory. By the 1980s, David's personal life had grown even more chaotic. A string of broken relationships, lawsuits, stints in rehab, and jail time for drug-related offenses left him isolated and financially unstable. He drifted in and out of brief recording contracts, each time making promises that he would be fully committed to a comeback. But the addiction tightened its grip, and he often fell off the wagon in dramatic fashion. There were stories of him showing up to recording studios under the influence, or disappearing for days while those waiting for him slowly realized that the man they once knew was slipping away. Meanwhile, public fascination with the Temptations continued. The group's legacy, reinforced by Motown nostalgia and new generations discovering classic R&B, led to documentaries and reunion tours. David was intermittently invited to participate in certain events along with Eddie Kendricks, another Temptations alumnus, but these cameo appearances sometimes turned sour behind the scenes. David's unpredictable nature, underscored by drug-fueled paranoia, made stable collaboration nearly impossible. Still, whenever he actually made it onto a stage and opened his mouth to sing, fans could catch that old spark of genius. It was heartbreaking, like a once brilliant star flickering in and out on a cloudy night. Despite all the drama, David Ruffin never completely lost the admiration of close friends and some loyal fans. Many attested to the depth of his kindness in moments of lucidity, describing him as generous, soft-spoken, and deeply spiritual underneath all the layers of anger and addiction. Eddie Kendricks, who had known David since before their Motown days, often tried to stand by him, even when it was difficult. In more private corners of David's life, there were glimpses of gentleness. Stories circulated about him quietly paying for a stranger's meal or offering support to local up-and-coming Detroit singers, providing them with tips and sometimes connecting them to producers. But in the public eye, David's image had spiraled into that of a cautionary tale who still possessed a voice that could break your heart. Time, however, waits for no one, especially in a fast-moving industry that was shifting toward disco, funk, and eventually hip-hop. By the mid-1980s, the golden era of Motown nostalgia was overshadowed by new trends, and David's attempts at a stable comeback faltered. His personal demons grew louder, overshadowing his occasional small triumphs. Yet, there remained a persistent glimmer of possibility. People who loved him, and even those in the music business who had long since given up on him, still believed that if he could just get clean and maintain it, he might reclaim a fraction of his old brilliance. Voices like his do not simply vanish. They leave an imprint on every ear they've ever touched. But life rarely follows neat story arcs. On June 1st, 1991, the news broke. David Ruffin had died of an apparent cocaine overdose at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. The initial story was perplexing and heartbreaking. David had reportedly been driven to the hospital by a friend, then left on the sidewalk, unconscious. He had no identification on him. Hospital staff labored to save him, but he never regained consciousness. Rumors circulated that some associate, fearing legal repercussions, had literally dumped David at the hospital and sped away. Whether that's the entire truth remains tangled in conflicting accounts, but the tragedy is stark. A man who once serenaded tens of thousands and enthralled the world with the promise of a timeless voice died alone under a wave of secrecy and confusion. When news of David's death spread, fans were stunned. Some who had long followed his story expressed sorrow mixed with a grim acceptance. They had feared this day might come, but they still felt the sting of it. Others were outraged by the rumors that he'd been left with no ID, effectively making him a John Doe in his final hours. The press, intrigued by the scandal, ran stories about his fall from grace, focusing on drugs, fights, and the wasted potential of a once great star. But close friends grieved more privately. They mourned a man who was never just a sensational headline, but who possessed a soul bigger than the mistakes that brought him down. As with any complex figure, The controversies around David's life did not cease in death. Questions lingered about the final circumstances of his overdose. Investigations sought to determine who had been with him, who might have supplied the drugs, and why he had been dropped off like a parcel, left to fend for himself in a condition that demanded urgent medical care. Some say David's lifestyle simply caught up with him. Others whispered about foul play or theft, claiming that a large sum of money he was rumored to have carried went missing after his death. The official accounts never fully clarified those mysteries, leaving a sense of unresolved tension around his final hours. Today, discussions about David Ruffin often circle back to that final heartbreaking night in 1991. People wonder how a man who once sang so passionately about love ended up dying in such a loveless circumstance. But it's important to remember that David's life was not defined solely by that final moment. He was once the spark that propelled an entire genre of music forward, enthralling fans worldwide and opening doors for more expressive and raw interpretations of soul. Even if his personal journey was riddled with darkness, the music remains as a testament to his incredible gifts. We can also learn from his story in a deeply human sense. David Ruffin reminds us that talent, no matter how remarkable, does not automatically grant emotional stability, healthy relationships, or self-love. Fame can amplify vulnerabilities as much as it amplifies gifts. Addiction and mental health struggles can strike anyone, regardless of their public persona. If nothing else, David's life is an example of how even the mightiest voices can be muffled by unresolved traumas and unchecked dependencies. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.